given the nature of this topic today, not only are we likely to be talking about suicide, but also obviously, well, I'll let Craig introduce some of the topic, but with child sexual abuse and things potentially featuring that could trigger other people in other ways as well. So just really mindful of that. And I know you'll all reach out if you're needing anything at all. So, yeah, so it's great to have you here, Craig. So, yeah, tell us who you are and tell us a little bit about your background and what's brought you to this place today.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thanks, Tynan, and to all of you. I am a survivor of child sexual abuse. I grew up in Adelaide. I left as soon as I could, as soon as school finished, to get the hell out of Dodge and away from what had happened. So I moved to Melbourne for about 11 or 12 years. I lived overseas for a bit and then moved back, but came to Sydney. So yeah, look, I'm just really glad to be here. I'm really glad. I didn't, to be honest, I didn't know about Roses in the Ocean until earlier this year. I'm sorry about that, but because, you know, I am a survivor of multiple suicide attempts. I lived with suicidal ideation on a daily basis for 20 years. I talk about that a lot now as a survivor advocate in the work that I do, because unfortunately I now know, after 10 plus years of working with many other, or hundreds of male survivors, is that it's not an uncommon experience in our cohort. So I always speak to that. So yeah, basically, you know, I made many suicide attempts, but 3 landed me on locked wards in hospitals. The first was when I was 21, the second was 29, the last was 35. And I'm really glad to sit here and be able to tell you that, amazingly, because I never thought this was possible, was that I don't live like that anymore. I'm now 55, and really it's been 15 years since I kind of had to deal with that ongoing suicidality and suicidal thoughts, both morning and night. So that in itself is a huge kind of leap forward for me, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. If you're wondering how on earth that happened, because I've often reflected on it, the key thing for me was meeting other male survivors of child sexual abuse. I went to the police and reported my 3 offenders about 13 years ago. And that resulted in 2 criminal trials about 10 years ago. At about that same time, I knowingly met another male survivor called Shane. He's a great guy, and we really hit it off. We're very different people, but just knowing that we had a similar experience kind of was, you know, brought us together. And in that conversation, we were talking about the lack of specialist support for male survivors in New South Wales. And, you know, I'm sure this is the way so many charities were started. We were saying, you know, someone should do something. And so 10 years later, we now employ 12 staff. We get government funding from both state, New South Wales, and federal money. We run 8-week groups for male survivors, which are facilitated by 2 facilitators, usually a social worker and a psychologist. We've run 84 of those groups in the last 10 years, which represents over 600 men. We have a wait list of over 200 men for those groups. And as our service has evolved over time, according to need, we run monthly meetings for guys who have completed an 8-week group. We run day-long workshops for our supporters, our family members, who are obviously equally impacted. And we do a lot of training to upskill anybody coming into contact with male survivors in their workplace. And a bunch of other stuff. We have a group of social workers who do what most people call case management. We don't like the term case or management. So we call it plan support. And that's really to help guys who are struggling with, you know, what could be a range of issues, including housing, finances, mental health, addiction, and so on and so on. So it's just that really practical support to help guys to meet them with where they are and to hopefully co-advocate alongside them to help them get some stability in their lives. One of the things that I'm really excited about, which is, you know, in part what you're doing here, I'm sure, is that peer support. So our model we describe as professionally facilitated peer support. Earlier, well, last year, we actually secured enough money to run a pilot program, a new initiative. It's called Talk with a Mate Who Can Relate. And it's giving guys the opportunity to set up a meeting with a survivor that's been trained in accidental counsellor, around suicide and suicidality, etc. So quite a comprehensive 7-day training course, including material that we've developed in-house as well. So these guys are all 8-week group alumni from our groups. And that's been running for, well, it's been running all year. It finishes in December. And it looks like we are thankfully going to secure more funding to keep that going, because what we found was that that was booking up. As soon as bookings opened a month in advance, they would all fill.
That's such a great service, and highlights the power of peer support within
absolutely
many sectors, particularly within like the world of suicide prevention, and particularly this network that the people who come here have a lived experience of suicide, and it's often conversations that you can have with a mate who's experienced something similar to you, that you really get a lot of benefit from it that you don't get in that clinical setting.
Yeah, 100%. So that's just a bit about me and a bit about samsn. I'm now in the role of CEO, but I know.
But just on the samsn part, I just wanted to stick with that for just for a second. So you guys have been going for 12 plus years now. Just wondering if you could just take us through like the journey around setting it up and how that actually, like the process behind that, because I always find it really interesting that you look at it 12 years on, but to go back to the early days about getting funding and really just creating that space within community.
Yeah, I'm glad to be asked that question and to talk to that. And it's really funny to look back, because in the beginning we had no money. We used to hold poker nights to raise money. We used to sell chocolates. We did whatever we could. And that money went into paying the professionals. And I use that term in inverted commas because I think personally that we're all professionals. We all have lived expertise and a lot to offer. But yeah, so there was a lot of work just doing the fundraising. And of course, initially we only ran 1 or 2 groups a year. That's all we could afford to do. We would meet at my house. Very quickly, there were 5 of us. Then we moved to a community centre in Erskineville. For those of you that know Sydney, it's like inner west. Thanks, Glenn. And so, yeah, basically a big shift. A couple of things happened. One was after my criminal trials, I was able to sue the state education department and also one of my perpetrators who had money. And so, you know, for the first time in my life, I had never had any money, right? I went with days without food and, you know, lived with great deprivation. So I suddenly had a lot of money and I thought, shit, you know, I was kind of scared by that. And it also felt like dirty money. And that's a problem that a lot of survivors who, you know, do get compensation or redress feel, that it's kind of yuck. And so all of this was happening at the same time. And I thought, you know what, the best thing I could do would be to invest X amount of this into samsn. It was a 6-figure sum, but it allowed me to leave my job and to focus on getting this organization up and running to get the momentum going. So really for about 18 months or more, I worked without pay. And ultimately it worked. We got our first bit of funding through New South Wales Victim Services. And that enabled my co-founder Shane to come and join me. And then not long after, we employed 2 social workers. That's the kind of really short version. There was a lot of angst along the way, a lot of frustration. I never felt like it was happening quick enough because I was so passionate and we knew the need was so great that I was always really frustrated. Looking back, it actually happened extraordinarily quickly. But one of the other key things was the announcement of the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, which I'm just going to assume that most of you would be well aware of. That was a 5-year Royal Commission. And of course, that changed the whole landscape. And so we were sitting back thinking, fuck, as the only specialist male support service in Australia, we thought, wow, what is going to happen? And so that just blew everything up and actually provided a whole lot of opportunities because no one else was doing this work.
Amazing. Change of topic slightly, just for a few moments. What role does acting play in your life? So I believe you're part of the Actors Centre of Australia. Tell us about that.
Not anymore. So basically, it's a great question. Jonathan, you've really thrown me. That's like a blast from the past, man. So basically, I grew up very passionate about the arts and acting and all of that. Unfortunately, one of my perpetrators was my drama teacher at school, and that then led me to leave all that behind me, and to the point where I couldn't even look at an advertisement in the newspapers in Victoria about that had anything to do with theatre or film for many, many years. And so I worked in hospitality, which was great because I very quickly became addicted to drugs and used alcohol to cope. And so working in hospitality was brilliant for getting away with that on a daily basis. But then when I moved to Sydney at that point, even though I was nowhere near even really coming to terms with what had happened and dealing with it, I did think at that point, I want to go back to something I really love. And so I ended up working in a theatre, just selling tickets. But that then led to, long story short, quite a long period working as an actor's agent, and then running a registered training organisation, which was a school. Our patron was Hugh Jackman. That was one of his schools. And that was kind of where I left before I started this job. Yeah.
And does that have any place in your life at the moment, acting? Is it an outlet that you still pursue at all? Or?
No, I was never really, I wasn't an actor. I was just behind the scenes kind of person. And still am, really. I kind of ended up being the front man of this organisation, which I struggle with as an advocate. I really kind of, probably maybe now, after 10 years or so of telling my story and talking to everyone from the Prime Minister down and different forums, I probably feel a bit more comfortable with it, but it's been a bit of a challenge. Yeah.
And that journey there, the actual sharing your story and advocating, I know that most of the people on this meeting at some form have done some advocating and sharing stories and things like that. And we all have certain moments in life where we can do it and can't do it. How does that flow with you? Is there certain periods in life when you can't, and how do you prepare to go up and share your story on a public forum? I imagine with the Prime Minister, that's a pretty high profile place to be sharing your story.
Yeah, I was really fortunate to be invited to sit on the Prime Minister's reference committee or group for the national apology that was delivered at the end of 2018 to survivors of child sexual abuse. I was one of 6 advocates to be on that, and it was amazing. What was really cool was that, it was a 6-month gig. Basically, we toured the country, and we talked to a range of survivors, anyone that wanted to come along to these forums that we had. We asked them what they wanted to hear in that apology, what language they didn't want to hear, and what was important to them. So that was a great privilege. And then in the lead up, we met with Malcolm Turnbull, as it happened the week before he got stabbed in the back. So that became a rehearsal. But then few weeks later, very early on in his tenure, we met with Morrison. But as advocates, each of us could actually raise anything we wanted in that meeting, which was amazing opportunity. But to answer your question, Tynan, there have been times, not often, but there have been times when I haven't been able to do it. And fortunately, I've been able to turn to Shane, my co-founder, and say, look, I can't do this today. And only a couple of times. Like the first time was actually back in Adelaide, where I grew up. And it was really weird because we were doing a day of training, and there were quite a few police there from South Australian Police Force and stuff. And it was too close to home. And so I just said, look, I can't do it. And so he was happy to do it on his own. So typically we would always do it together. So I wasn't on my own. Probably more recently, I do quite a bit more, not on my own, but with one of our professionals. So one of my colleagues who's a social worker or psychologist. But yeah, look, it was just early on, a lot of shame, a lot of feelings of feeling really, I could walk away feeling really raw and exposed and kind of embarrassed and, oh, fuck, what did I say? And shit, I shouldn't have said that, and, everything. So it probably took me really 3 years before I started to feel kind of some level of comfort. It was kind of torture. But I think what kept me going was just the knowledge that every time I did it, invariably, someone will come up to me with a story of their own. And that was either they were a survivor or their brother or blah, blah, dad or whatever. Like there's always someone in the crowd that will really appreciate.
And again, that's a great example of the power of vulnerability and being open to share your story. Earlier today, when we connected just to touch base and make sure everything was working, I sort of spoke to you about one of the things that I'd read in sort of doing a bit of research around you was that in the workshops that you run, you talk about the types of supports that work best to support men who have been through these experiences. And as I sort of explained, one of the objectives that we've sort of been doing and about the survey that we put out was to really identify what are the best things that we can do to develop or create for men to basically prevent men from dying by suicide. I'm just wondering if you could just talk to the process that you went through around developing this sort of information for people to have that to best support them, and the things that you learned from that, and the things that failed, and things that you grew from, and what that looks like now.
We've really tweaked and we've listened. I'm kind of really quite proud to say that as a organization that's now been around 10 years, which is maybe in some people's eyes quite new still, everything we do has been has evolved according to demand, and it's come from the guys, really. So one of the things, as an example, we have had a few days where we've got together different cohorts of men. So for those of you that don't know, the general stat is 1 in 6 men have been victims of child sexual abuse. And one of the things that we really wanted to do was create a safe space by these 8-week groups. A lot of the guys, so just going back, I got a bit, I threw myself off then. One of the practical things we did was to get together. Why I mentioned that stat was because most men in the Royal Commission found this in their research, was that most men wait considerably longer than women to disclose. So the average time is 25 years before they'll tell anybody about their history. And so one of the things that we've been really mindful of is to hopefully try and connect with men who are younger, because if we can do that and help them to join the dots, that if they are struggling with things like addiction, homelessness, etc., relationships and intimacy and so on, then, I believe that there's information they can get their hands on that would help. So we held a couple of day-long workshops, one with younger guys who had been in touch with our service, so guys in their 20s, to ask them, what worked and what didn't in terms of our engagement, and moving forward, how we might be able to use social media and what their thoughts were on about, messaging for younger men. We also did another one with Indigenous men, Aboriginal brothers, and just sort of talk to them. How can we better engage with, you know, your mob? And that was brilliant. So really it's about, you know, kind of listening to people's needs, and providing them with what's often called psycho-educational material. I don't like the word psycho. It always makes me think of the shower and the nice scenario. But you know, I think of it as transformational information. And a lot of that stuff in my space is around grooming, what grooming means and how it looks for the individual, because a lot of us as adults understand or think we understand, you know, generally what grooming is. But actually, as a survivor, to apply that to your own situation in detail is really important, because so many survivors feel complicit, because that is part of what grooming does. And you know, recovery from this can't be done, as with most things, can't be done in isolation. But I think that's probably a real common denominator for a lot of survivors, is that they're very isolated. They feel very isolated.
Yeah, definitely. And look, you mentioned before about your own lived experience of suicide as well, and you mentioned the statistics about the high proportion of men who have had child sexual abuse have then experienced suicidal thoughts of suicide or non-fatal attempts, or even died by suicide. With all that in context, how does your lived experience of suicide, how does that link in with the work that you do? And is there anything that you draw from that, or things that, yeah, I guess, direct the way that you work, like on that strategic level?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I guess that we're as a service, we're very mindful that we are overrepresented and hidden in the suicide stats. Again, just to quote some figures, some of you may already know this, but there were a couple of really distinct hotspots in Australia, and one was Ballarat, where over 40 suicides were directly related to child sexual abuse. In Newcastle, it was over 70. And actually, it was the death of a guy called John Perona, who actually in his suicide note indicated that he was a survivor of child sexual abuse, that sort of, you know, really sparked the Royal Commission actually, and really encouraged people to speak up. So, and, you know, there was an Australian study between 64 and 95, a longitudinal study that looked at nearly 3,000 forensic and coronary records that showed that, you know, men really are, with a history of CSA, are 10 times the risk of suicidality and suicide. So they're pretty shocking stats. But, you know, what I found is that no one's really talking about it. So look, in answer to your question, and we spoke about this afternoon, I'll recount this again. You know, just before I left for overseas a few months ago, I had the pleasure of talking to a young guy in his 20s, and he was really struggling. I was the first survivor that he's ever talked to, which is not uncommon. And you know, after sort of talking about a range of issues that he was dealing with, including, you know, depression and addiction, and issues with his girlfriend, he said, "Oh, there's this other thing as well." And I said, "Oh, yeah." And I had no idea what he was going to say, but he said, "Oh, sometimes I think about suicide." And I said, "Yeah, you know, that's not uncommon." And I could tell he was so hesitant. I can't get into his head and tell you why, but, you know, we can only imagine why. Because I think so often responses to that kind of disclosure are more concerned with risk for the service than the actual person. And I just know as a survivor that being able to talk about thoughts of suicide is really important. And if that is met with a panicked response in terms of, are you safe today? Where are you now? Blah, 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 and 20 questions, which you get from most of the phone lines, if not all of them, like that kind of stuff's really unhelpful, right? I don't know if that's controversial or not in your space. I see people nodding, but just to be able to sit with him and say, you know what, that's that's normal. So much of what I talk to the guys about, like, they've got no idea, right? They just think I'm a freak because my perpetrator was a male. Does that mean I'm gay? Is it true that because I'm a survivor, I'm more likely to go on to perpetrate against children? I mean, that's just, there's no research or evidence that backs that myth up. But I think I would say that it's probably the biggest barrier to disclosure for men. Interestingly, that does not apply to women. I think is interesting. Because, you know, women are the caregivers, and generally what happens for men is you grow up as a boy, then you become a man, and on that day, you then a potential perpetrator of all sorts of things. And, you know, I don't want to get too political, but, you know, it's interesting, the Me Too space, the DV space, there's a lot of very loud, effective voices in that space. But the idea that all men benefit from the patriarchy, or that all men are potential perpetrators and are never victims, is absurd. And, you know, I look at the impacts of abuse across society and the economic impacts. And, you know, it's enormous, as with suicide. So these two things converge in a really clear way for us.
Definitely. And the statistics that you sort of just spoken about, and even the myths and stuff that sit around that space, although I hadn't heard them before, like, I'm not shocked. Like, the way that you speak, I can see that correlation that links them very, very closely with the network. Like, you've had massive growth, and I think you said you've had 84 programs, 600 men. Where do you want to go? Like, where to from here?
Global.
That's amazing.
That's
and
what
you mentioned. Yeah, you mentioned.
Well, I've always joked about that, Tyler. Right from day one, I said we're going global as a joke. But I guess, you know, maybe I was only half joking. But seriously, at this point, we're the only specialist support service for male survivors in Australia, and we're pretty much all our services are available in New South Wales. We have more recently received some funding to do work in Tassie and South Australia. But, you know, we still don't have the capacity to deal with or be truly national service, which we really need to be. I'm really glad that we have a change in government. Purely because, in part, we're now dealing with a government that actually announced that Royal Commission, and therefore probably have a more of a understanding, from my own experience talking to these people, a greater understanding, empathy, compassion, and an obligation and commitment because of that Royal Commission, which costs over $400 million. So I'm really hoping that we can, at this point, scale up and build capacity so that we're truly national. But having just come back from this 10-week trip, in which I was meeting with, you know, a range of people who work in this space in America, UK, Ireland, and Spain, yeah, the issues are very similar around the world on this issue. And it's largely around gender stuff. A lot of it's around gender stuff. It's a very gendered issue, which is interesting because, you know what, when you talk about you know, DV and women, and the amount of women that get murdered in this country, which none of us would disagree is appalling, and a lot needs to be done. There's no doubt about that. And I wouldn't want to take $1 from any government funding directed to effective services. Equally, we're losing, I would suggest, probably more survivors in real terms, both male and female, to a suicide. And there's no national outrage about that. And that's puzzling to me, you know.
Yeah. I've got a couple more questions, but I'd love to go to John, who's got a question, and invite others to also think about what you'd like to throw into the mix. John.
Yeah, sorry I'm happy to leave it to the end, but it was just pertinent to that point you just made, Craig. Having had some experience both, with talking to samsn early about, from a collaboration point of view. And I've recently had sent a couple of blokes to samsn, right? So the things that the thing that really struck me is like the immediacy of the crisis. Like we're all struggling to react and get more upstream so that it doesn't get to crisis, right? So like a proactive element of getting out there to have conversations. And like I'm looking at it and going, there's no way we can build or I suggest, do we want a corporate structure that matches, like the bill centralizes and manages everything? Again, we're just replicating the system that isn't working. So what about, have you considered or sort of put in plans or discussed the concept of, asset audits around, the men here, for instance, have networks of male organizations, circles. We spoke earlier about Table, Men's Walk, Mr. Perfect, all these organizations, about embedding champions in there so that actually that we can build infrastructure that is co-operated, that we are actually samsn aware. Because I've been working with a bloke who was part of the Royal Commission, right? But his thing, and he is so like, he would murder that man on spot if he got a chance, right? So, one of the teachers at one of the schools that was involved, we all know, some of the details, but without identifying him, the issues in life and are stress related to the normal challenges of life. We don't talk about it, but there's no doubt in my mind that that the coping mechanism with normal daily stress is impacted on on an allostasis basis, right? From the experiences as a child, right? So,
John, Jesus, I'm so glad you said that. Sorry, have you finished or am I interrupting you?
No, go for your life, mate. We want to hear you, not me.
Yeah, look, I'm really glad you said that, because we actually did, when I was talking with Tynan and Jonathan earlier, we touched on that. It seems really obvious to me now, as I've kind of learned, and my recovery has really progressed lockstep with samsn, as we built this organization. I mean, I needed the organization, right, as much as anybody. So that's why we started it. And so I'm in a very different place now than I was, 10 years ago. Still struggle, of course, but much, much different space in a way I never thought possible. And I want that for other people. I think, unfortunately, and again, this might be controversial, but I've got to a point where I don't give a fuck. Basically, there are a lot of services out there that like Beyond Blue, I'm sorry, but generic depression, like there is not, last time I did an audit of their website, there's not one mention of child sexual abuse on their website. Now, if you are a survivor of CSA and you're feeling depressed and you go to their website and you see nothing about CSA on their website, what does that tell you? It says you're invisible. It says you don't matter. It also, I think there's a level of negligence, because we did have a Royal Commission and we've all had an education, right? Now, I don't mean to suggest that, everyone that dies by suicide is a survivor, but I will say this, what we also know through a lot of research is that child abuse is huge. The impacts are enormous, whether it's neglect, whether it's physical, whether that's coupled with sexual or mental, it is hugely harmful. We all know this. This is not groundbreaking stuff. But what I think we tend to do is patch people up. What I know, and what because I see it every day, guys come to their knees often because of a marriage breakup, job loss, all these things, all the catalysts for, the triggers. If that is undercut by cumulative trauma going back to your childhood, you're not going to have the resilience, and potentially you are not going to seek help. I tried to seek help after I was abused for years by a friend of our family. I went to a school teacher. He was an opportunistic pedophile, and he started abusing me. He was married with children, so was the third. So, you know, these sorts of things, you can imagine why people don't ask for help, because that's not safe to ask for help. And you've been fed a whole lot of lies about how important you are and all these sorts of things. So who do you trust? So, you know, if you're living in a world where you have struggled like mad to be a man and be in control and be successful and and all of a sudden the wheels start coming wobbly, you know, the likelihood that you're going to be able to A, reach out and seek help, B, disclose about what's really underlying all the issues you may have, and feel confident that you're going to be understood in the face of a whole lot of myths around sexual abuse, you start to see how difficult it is, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of these services really need to understand that at depth, because the people I work with or talk to in homelessness, like those of you in Sydney, the Wayside Chapel, you know, like those guys make an assumption now that the people they're dealing with are going to be survivors of child sexual abuse, because 9 times out of 10, that is what they disclose. In rehabs, in our prisons, and so on, this is where we are ending up. And those services need to be trained and upskilled in this area so that they can take disclosures in whatever way they're presented, because sometimes it's a part disclosure just to test the waters in terms of safety. It's not like I was abused when I was 7. You know, there's different signs and different language that you can kind of tune into if you know what you're looking for, and giving people the opportunity to not only disclose, but also give them a sense of hope that there are people who get it. And the most common thing, just to finish on this, the most common thing I've heard in 10 years when I'm talking to people is, oh, you get it.
Wow.
And it's beautiful, because, you know, when you're a survivor and you're trying to work this out, you know, you spent your whole adult life trying to make sense of what does not make sense on your own. And then you're talking to someone who does get it, and you don't have to try and explain in words that you can't find. It's a massive, massive relief for these men. Yeah.
Amazing comment, and actually a really powerful one, in the sense that, you know, if you haven't thankfully experienced those things, then you can't get it. Which doesn't mean you can't be helpful, but you need to be able to acknowledge that you may not get it.
Yeah.
Anyway, Glenn, you got your hand up.
Craig, mate, I can't thank you enough for being here tonight. I'm going to say that the nearly 5 years I've been doing this and sitting down with people one-on-one, I can honestly say I have sat with more men who have been victims of child sexual assault than what I have women. And I can also say that from first-hand experience, my son went through a massive amount of domestic violence and from a female perpetrator, and we could get him no help at all, because he was never believed. And no resources available for him. And he had but I picked him up from a service station in Canberra with a 3-month-old in his arms, and we could not get him 1 ounce of help because he was male. But what you've said today resonates so much, because I've sat and had these conversations and know we look at the fact that we're lived experience in suicide. We have lived experience in suicidality, and that's recognised as being specialised. We don't recognise, as you've said, the speciality of being lived experience in sexual assault. And I just wish to Christ I'd known about you earlier over the last couple of years. I really, really do. And I can't wait to sit down with my clinician tomorrow and sit down and say, look, mate, we've got something that we really need to be able to support. I just wish we could pick you up and bring you down here to the far south coast. Because it's wrong, it's bullshit. It's more prevalent that I've worked with than I have with females. And the shame, the the heartbreak of hearing those stories sometimes for the first time in 30 years. I've walked down a appointment and just sat in the corner of the office and broken down in tears. So to you, mate, you're a fucking champion, and what you are doing, it's just fucking magic. Thank you.
Wow, thanks, Glenn. I really appreciate that. And you know what? I'm glad you sort of shared that, and thank you, because it's hard work. It's hard work, and it's scary for people. And, you know, despite the Royal Commission, it's still a very challenging subject for people. No one wants to talk about it. And, you know, I feel for the workers like yourself, all of you who work in this space. You are going to come across people who have this history. And that's why I say, you know, people need to be upskilled, trained, supported to take disclosures, because you need to take care of yourselves as well. Because also too, I think if you guys are confident in how to do these things and talk to men, then they're going to sense that. And I tell you what, there is nothing greater than being trusted with this information. Absolutely. It is such a privilege. And at the end of the day, as Glenn would know, you don't have to do anything. All you have to do is be there and listen and not freak out. You know, you don't have to rush in and try and fix it or solve it or, you know, make platitudes. You just have to be there and go, I believe you, I hear you, and what can I do for you? Where are you right now? That is a huge step forward for a lot of people that have never had that. So thanks, Glenn.
Thanks, yeah, Glenn and Craig. And just before I come to you, Tony, I'm wondering if you can just give us a bit of a sense. Two things. One is, what are there some particular signs that we can look out for that are indicators that somebody might be holding this back? And secondly, what is, whilst funding obviously is a question, let's say we had funding down here in Tassie and we wanted to be able to get you to come down. I know you have done something down here recently, but
yeah,
if we want to do it again, what are the options, and how do we get that happening?
Great question. So look, I think a lot of the signs really, I mean, you know what, I'll give you an example from my own experience. So when I disclosed to my family, you know, they had seen me struggle for years. They had no idea why. I thought I was mad, bad, sad. And, you know, when I told them, they were like, oh my God, of course, that explains everything. So the addiction, the depression, the suicide attempts, all of it made sense all of a sudden, which is why I believe that there is a strong onus on the organizations that are supporting people who find themselves in these predicaments to actually be aware and be skilled. And to be confident enough, I'll give you one example. Well, a bit of an anecdote. It's quite funny to me because you've got to have a black sense of humor. But I was at a homeless shelter, and I was being given a tour by the manager, and she introduced me to some of the staff, and this one particular guy said, oh wow, that's really amazing and good for you. And I said, you must get a lot of disclosures working here, you know. And he said, yeah, you know, I had one just the other day. And I said, oh, how did you handle it? He said, I pretended not to hear because I didn't know what to say. And I remember thinking, well, A, you need some training, but B, the look on the manager's face, she was completely horrified, you know. And I was like, fuck. But I mean, that's the reality, right? People are just, you know, whether willfully or not, or they just, you know, they think they're going to do more damage than good or whatever. But I also think, you know, to your question, part of your question, Jonathan, as well, what we have done, I love these workshops. They're incredibly powerful, as you would imagine. They're day-long workshops for supporters and survivors. Because if you think about, you know, a survivor and the context in which they've grown up, if they're in a family unit, it's going to impact parents, siblings. It's going to then impact future relationships that they have at work or intimate relationships. And so you see this tsunami effect, I call it, much bigger than a ripple. And these people are thinking, what the hell is going on with you? You know what I mean? And if in fact they do get a disclosure, and I got to tell you guys, you know, early on with Samson, I remember turning to my co-founder, Shane. We'd been given an office in a law firm that specialized working with personal injuries, claims of this sort. And I said to him, my God, all these women are calling up. And it was wives of guys who'd found us on Google and had rung and said, like just beside themselves, my husband's just disclosed, my boyfriend's just disclosed, my son's just disclosed. I have no idea what to do, you know? And these poor people, you know, who are just at a loss and in the same situation, because all of a sudden now they're holding that secret. And who did they talk to for support? Who are they going to talk to that might understand what they're feeling and the questions they have? So it's a big education piece, and we need to bring the community with us, because, you know, I strongly believe that until as adults we can talk about this shit, forget about child protection. People often say, oh, how do we protect our kids? Well, we learn how to talk about this. Who's that friendly person?
That's John Eddy, one of my colleagues.
Okay. So yeah, you know what I mean? Like the longer I'm around, I'm just thinking, God, if we can't talk about this and address this issue and deal with it as adults, how can we really make any great strides in terms of protecting our children?
Yeah. Wow, amazing point. Tony.
Yeah, that bit about the wives and what do they do. I remember when we put on a miniature version of a shed in the Katoomba Winter Festival. We'd have a guy in the shed sort of there, and blokes and their partners would come up the street, and the women would come over and engage with the shed, and the bloke would be hanging back in the middle of the street. So what we did was have one guy in the shed and then three guys in the street, and while she's talking to him, we'd nudge him and say, your wife's interested in that. What's your thinking? But what was coming up, thank you, Craig. Like everybody else, I really appreciate everything you said. No disagreement whatsoever. Just to share some of our experience, and it builds on Jonathan's point of what are the signs that we can pick up on. They're very often subtle. We have learnt to look within the work we're doing in the Eltham Men's Shed, that any strong feeling that so often drives the way that people think and behave often has something going on underneath it. And that anger is very often a good sign that there's something going on. Hurt, depression, just as you can pick up on the addictions, the kind of run away and hide stuff. And that for a lot of blokes who have got that thing that they're carrying, they're torn between wanting to get the anger out and finding no avenue to release it, so it turns in on themselves. We managed to crack it in the shed, and this confirms your view about the scale of the problem. There are 100 members in the shed. We got about 20 odd involved through an anger management workshop, which was working quite light, but it just started to lift the lid. There was obviously something there. So we put on a backup one called Working with Shame, and the lid really came off. Just at the level of one guy indicating there was something that he was didn't really want to talk about, but it was like concerning him. We've had now for the last 4.5 years, an ongoing fortnightly men's group. Within that, when this guy finally opened up, the response was 5 other men in the room, disclosing that they too shared that experience.
Wow.
For him, it was to normalize something that he had sat on, shoved down. One of the guys hadn't even told his wife. When he came back the next week, having done that disclosure, he reported that she'd said to him, well, I knew there was something there that you didn't want to talk about, but since you didn't want to talk about it, I left it alone. But I'm sorry, I always knew there was something there. Thank you. So that kind of stuff there. And so what we're looking at is those patterns of aggression, violence, anger, expression, the beat up on self stuff, the attack self mode, the run away and hide from stuff, and all then the denial stuff, which usually plays itself out as the addictions, as avoidance patterns for the underlying shame. And that the thing that is critical is for these guys to understand that what they're doing is actually shame avoidance. That shame is an invitation to reflect, change, see what needs to be changed, and to balance it with that sense of pride and dignity. That there is huge dignity in being able to stand in that space and say, I have this experience in my past and I know I'm not alone and something needs to be done about it. So just as we know with trauma, so often what helps people to recover is having an avenue where they can get a sense of pride, dignity, self-respect for disclosure, being in it, and sometimes being able to help others. So that seems to me the kind of the pattern that we're walking at. What you've done today is absolutely to bring it in our face, and in terms of what you presented and how you presented it. So thank you and congratulations. If there's anything we can do, I would like to see how part of your thing can be expanded into the men's shed networks.
I would love that, Tony, and thank you so much.
Because we're talking here about not guys who've shoved it down for 5 years. Some of them have shoved it down and hidden it for 50 years or more.
Tony, you asked a great question and you answered it really well. So congratulations. I don't have to say a word. I think the anger thing is really interesting. And just to point that, I mean, I do think it doesn't get discussed enough. You know, people don't think these things through, and I don't expect them to, because again, if that's not your experience, you're not really necessarily going to get it and join the dots. But man, you know, I had so much anger. I had so much anger, and anything would set me off. And when I would get upset as a teenager, unless I smashed something, I couldn't calm down. So literally I would, you know, I'd punch my door, I'd break a mirror, I'd do whatever, because, and even that went right into my adulthood, actually. At one point when I was really depressed and frustrated and at a real end, I literally trashed everything in my apartment, to the point where the neighbors actually called the police because they thought I was being attacked. The only thing I didn't trash was my TV, because I couldn't afford a new one. But you know, this is the thing. I think the anger thing is a big one. It's a really big one, because of course you're going to feel fucking angry, and you've got every right to feel furious. You know, when you've had your human rights taken from you as a child, when you've had your own right to sort of just explore your own sexuality as a child, you know, these things you can't get back, and it makes people really angry. So you identified all those things, Jonathan, you know, and it's very touching. And I remember talking to our patron, Robert Fitzgerald, who was one of the Royal Commissioners, and after the Royal Commission, he very kindly joined us as patron. You know, there were bedside disclosures from men in their 70s who were dying, who had never told anybody, and contacted the Royal Commission for what they called private sessions. And the commissioner went in and sat with these guys, and literally they said, I don't want to die without telling anyone. And the main motivator for 9 out of 10 people was, I just want this to change. And if by my disclosing to this Royal Commission will make a difference in the future, that's why I'm doing it. It's very powerful.
John.
Yeah, sorry guys. I just want to follow up John's, and there's a lot of Johns on here, so it must be a really good session. John's question about asking, is it okay to ask? Obviously, high level of rapport and trust required, and it must be a safe space, right? But is that something, or do you wait for disclosure, or can you, because often, like as I mentioned earlier, I've had a conversation with a man who has childhood sexual abuse. I know that for a fact because it's been mentioned but not discussed, right? Now, we talk about a lot of things that are clearly, sort of consequences or collateral or comorbid, terrible term, but we don't directly mention it, although he has mentioned about his emotions towards perpetrator and stuff. That's part one of my question. Part two is, what about perpetrators? Because behavior is not the man. And I love that follow-up question from Jonathan about, are survivors likely to be, perpetrators likely to be survivors? But, treating, in mentoring men, there's a bit of a crisis when people discussed, do we treat men who are guilty of DV or guilty of sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse? Because most men are horrified and won't touch them, but I don't know that serves the community. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, and I hope that's not a triggering question.
No, that's not. Thank you. I think to the first part of that question, which related to survivors, didn't it, and how you might encourage them to talk, for want of a better phrase. I think sometimes people will give a part disclosure, like they might say, oh, shit happened to me as a kid, but I'm over that now, or whatever. Like sometimes they can be missed, those sorts of things. Or I had a bit of a rough childhood, but whatever, they kind of might blow it off. I think that even just being able to say, again, normalization has been mentioned a few times tonight. And I think if you feel comfortable enough to say, yeah, a lot of people have, without obviously making it kind of like a generalized statement that kind of undercuts perhaps the seriousness of it, but just to say, look, yeah, if you ever feel like, you'd like to have a chat about anything that, was in your childhood that's troubling you, please feel welcome to. If you get more of a disclosure that's more sort of specific, and you feel comfortable having heard me or done training or some reading, then the benefit of actually getting to know what most male survivors of child sexual abuse face, and there are a lot of similarities in terms of how we respond and how we cope and the unhelpful coping mechanisms. Even if you can just go, you know what, I'm not a survivor myself, but I've actually talked to a lot of survivors, and I've also done a bit of reading, and I've done some training with an organization that's brilliant called samsn, Survivors and Mate Support Network. I don't know if you know of them, but what I know from all of that is A, B, C, D. And what you've just told me, from what I know about male survivors, it's actually really common. And to give them some information and pass that on can be really helpful. Does that help and answer that question?
That's great response, I reckon.
And look, the second part, which relates to perpetrators, which I'm really happy to answer, and it's taken me quite a long time to get there, because initially I was like, I don't want to hear about perpetrators. I don't want to know about sex offenders, of course, and I don't care about them. I've actually come to a place now, all these years down the track, and certainly after the trip that I've just done, in understanding that we can't, we have to have a response. If you just go with a pure law and order, all perpetrators should be locked up and thrown in jail and have their nuts cut off, not all of which I disagree with, we're not going to get anywhere. We have to understand that this is an issue that needs to be dealt with. And most countries don't deal with it very well. Some do, and those that do actually have support programs for potential perpetrators and for convicted sex offenders. And so we do have to, again, we have to grow up. We have to realize these people need more than just locking up in jail and then being released. If then at the moment, really the only option in this country is to try and source a specialist one-on-one professional for help. So we need to do a hell of a lot better in that regard. DV, there is no excuse for it. And I don't for 1 minute want to suggest that our guys are saints any more than I am. You know, we've all done things we're not proud of. And unfortunately, I do know, and because I've heard it firsthand, that some of the guys have taken their anger out on their partners. You know, we don't condone violence in any form, in any situation. It's not okay. But again, you know, you need to have a more nuanced understanding, because if we just say all perpetrators are evil bastards and ignore what might actually be driving that kind of anger, it's not about making an excuse. It's just about getting to the bottom of it, right? And having a more mature, nuanced, sophisticated, intelligent discussion about how we treat these issues. And I'm not suggesting that all perpetrators of DV are survivors of child abuse today, you know, by any stretch. But, you know, these are some of the complexities that I just don't think we necessarily deal with very well, in part because a lot of the government funding system and strategies like kind of pit organizations against each other, and we need to be working together so that we're giving warm referrals, right? And we know when to actually say, you know what, we can help you with A, B, C, but in this regard, you might want to consider going to A, B, C or D, E, F to get that specialized help. And you know, the importance of peer support. It's a big part of what we do. I suspect it's a big part of what all of you guys do. I'm telling you, you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but it's vitally important. It's vitally important for guys to realize that there is hope, to get a sense of recovery and healing and what that might look like for them. And also acknowledging their own resilience, which is, I think we don't do a lot of. You know, I think in our society, we're very corrective when it comes to men. We're very quick to point out what we're doing wrong and saying, you know, you're not doing this right. You know, you shouldn't be doing that. All of that sort of stuff. We need to role model better. We need to, you know, be more supportive, right? I think that's just the culture we're in. It's like, you know, you can't seem to get anything right. So guys are confused, you know. And then when we talk about toxic masculinity, which I think is an incredibly unhelpful term, which basically says anyone that has any masculine traits is toxic. I mean, that is ridiculous. You know, we've got to start talking about what is healthy masculinity.
Craig,
you know,
thank you so much. You've really shone light onto a topic that, to be honest, I feel so much better for having this information that we've got now. We're going to pass to Jason for one final question, but Craig, I'm pretty confident that we would love to have you back on for another conversation and unpack this a bit more. And to be honest, I see so much alignment with the work that we do that we can definitely look to collaborate and do whatever we sort of can down the line. But Jason, we'll go to you for one last question, and then JB's got a final question from us, and then we'll wrap up. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, well, between the end of Craig's kind of what he was saying there and what you just said, Tony, you pretty much covered any comment I was going to kind of make just around that, you know, the power of the peer support, because, you know, that the conversation that you're having there, it's, you know, it's exactly the same, almost exactly the same conversation that we're having in the work that we're doing up here, but it's in suicide prevention. And yeah, so it just goes to show that power of peer support, but then also, you know, the importance of workers that may not have that experience being able to build empathy as well, because, you know, they can be, you know, of some help. It's just that being willing to try and create that empathy. In terms of the program, is it like a phone or online service only? Do you do any face-to-face depending on where people are calling from?
Yeah, both. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, both.
Yeah, okay.
Obviously, COVID kind of pushed us online, which was a silver lining, really, because now we're running both groups in person, you know, in a range of places around New South Wales, but also online, which is great, which really opens it up.
Yeah, and that's good to know. Is it actually appropriate for people from elsewhere in the country outside New South Wales to be able to connect people into the online groups?
Unfortunately, not at this point. We about 2 years ago, maybe we had to make the decision that we just couldn't cater for everyone across the country when we didn't have the funding. So, but I will say, you know, to end on a really positive note, and I have a feeling it is positive, that we've got a few really key meetings soon with senior government ministers, which may just get us over the line and enable us to scale up and go truly national.
Yeah.
So I will keep you posted on that. But I've just posted my email. I'd love to hear from you guys. You know, if we can help your organizations in any way, love to.
So I do have one final question. So
sorry, we've actually got about 1,000 final questions, but we're just going to go with one.
We're going to go with one, yeah. Look, obviously working in the space you're in, and in a way it's multiple spaces, the child sexual abuse space, but also suicide prevention and suicide issues. How do you manage your self-care? What do you do to look after yourself on a daily, weekly basis to continuously hold these conversations?
Well, I think passion counts for a lot. I'm really inspired by the guys, you know, in no small way. You know, I do get to meet incredible guys, but separate to that, personally, I've got some really great friends. I've got very supportive family, for which I'm really grateful, because not everybody has that, of course. And, you know, I do stuff like, I love music, live music, love kayaking, just getting into walking again. I've got a psychologist. I actually had a break from therapy for a few years, which probably was actually a bit longer than it should have been, because things got a bit rough for me, as it did with so many people during COVID. And I suddenly thought, you know, I'm not traveling that well. I need to see someone. And so I'm seeing a new psychologist. He's great. He really understands adult survivors. And yeah, just trying to keep it real. You know, I never want to give the impression that I've got my shit together, because I don't. And I think that's important for people to hear, and important equally for survivors to understand that, you know, it's a journey. I hate to use that hackneyed phrase, but, you know, it's a journey, but there's also, you know, early recovery, which can be incredibly challenging and for all sorts of reasons. But yeah, as with everything, you know, I think when you can get to a point where you realize actually everyone's dealing with shit, your shit just looks a little bit different, smells a little bit different, but actually, if you can just push through and talk to other people, you know, I think everyone needs that, don't they? You know, we all need that, and not to be judged. Yeah.
Fantastic. Craig, thank you so much for everything you're doing, obviously in your work, and for your time coming here today. Looks like you've frozen on my screen. Hopefully you're still with us. I'm mindful also that we haven't even touched on your recent experiences. You've been away on a Churchill Fellowship, traveling around the world, talking to other people. I think it'd be fantastic to be able to hear more about that. So yeah, maybe another time.